Hello again. Yesterday, someone pointed out to me that I spoke way too fast. That was a fair point. It is a known bug with me, and that is the reason I always tell my jokes twice. But do not worry, a known bug is not a problem. That is what we learned yesterday. Fail, learn, evolve. So today, Siri will assist me. The topic of this design salon is, how do we design products that have no visible interface? What skill sets do we need? And who are we to dress up machines as human beings? We already heard 3 great talks on this. Now we have a chance to meet the 3 together in a discussion on conversational UI, and you have the opportunity to take part. It's a pleasure to introduce these 3 great speakers. Please welcome back Cheryl Platz, Kovpor, and Blajena Janborsic.
Okay, this is going to take a while. I'm going to type in my questions as we go along. Sorry about that. Someone came up to me yesterday, and I do speak really fast. Sorry about that. But then you came on, and it seems like a smaller problem all of a sudden.
Yeah, that's good. I can help.
Well, you all been talking more or less on the same topic, coming at it from different angles. And I was just thinking, as a first question to get into this, why is it it's coming now? I mean, we have had sort of chatty conversational UIs for so long. I remember before my time, Eliza, the therapist. And then you had sort of chatty conversational games in the 80s. And then you had Clippy, which you showed off, coming into the 90s. And then it sort of disappeared again. I didn't really take off. So what happened? Why is it happening now? We start our show?
Sure. Well, part of it's computational. You guys made a point earlier that conversational UI has been around for a very long time. And even back in the 70s, the 50s and 60s, there was research particularly about voice UI, but the speech scientists found out very quickly that there was no way that the computing technology available to them could keep up with the infinite possibilities of analog speech. And so just recently, we finally started walking around with computers in our pockets that could keep up. It's amazing how much spoken interface is still a brute force problem. Like to build a system like Alexa or OK Google or something along those lines, it takes a tremendous amount, tens upon tens of thousands of spoken utterances to build that initial sort of understanding. But once we were able to do that, I think it recaptured the public's imagination. Once you had an Alexa that could talk to you, suddenly conversation in general, people felt more human. They wanted to seek that out more.
So it's technology. Do you agree?
I mean, yeah, partly, of course. Technology is like kind of important. You can't really do anything without that following. But I also think what we've seen lately is there's a lot of new interfaces coming up, a lot of new devices, VR, AR, we're seeing speakers, and that is also kind of like demanding a new way of interacting with those devices. And I think like VR is a good example where many times you're standing actually pointing at a keyboard. And then suddenly, as designer, as a company, realize, okay, this is not the ideal interaction, so we're kind of being forced to invent or find new ways. And I think for us, we see conversational interfaces is more like a new trend towards natural interfaces, like mimicking natural interactions with digital, whether that's a real-life object in augmented reality, or whether that's you just talking to your speaker or texting.
So that's kind of you taking all this. It's kind of how you work. Everything is just the beginning for something new. So, what do you say? I'm thinking computers, technology is getting stronger. You can ask more, but it's also much less strict. Where you have a graphical user interface, very much defines what you can ask, what conversation you can have, what kind of response you can expect. When I speak with someone, I expect them to be human and answer my questions. So I have a much broader scope, and it makes computers look pretty stupid.
Well, computers kind of are stupid, right? They only do what you explicitly tell them to do. And I think Cheryl's points both their points are pretty much cover it all. And maybe there's also a little bit of comfort. we've gotten more comfortable with technology. We have generations, for the first time, they're growing up with tablets and phones, and it feels more natural to talk to a computer now for more people.
Any questions?
I had one more thing to, while
Yeah, no,
we're getting the questions, just while we started talking about this, it also occurs to me the role of popular culture, and you know, it's a chicken and an egg problem. It's hard to tell what comes first, but if you look at in the 80s and 90s, spoken conversational interfaces were often antagonistic. They were painted as sort of negative. We have HAL and we have war games, but then in the last few years, the spirit, sort of the imagination of filmmakers and television artists sort of captured like Her, and it became less antagonistic. It became a little bit more human, raised some really interesting questions. You know, Her isn't exactly a happy ending story, but it made it seem a little less like us versus them, and that I think that might have also contributed to folks being ready for it when it happened.
But it's true, but it's also, we're also laughing a lot about the whole speaking computers. My kids can sit for hours with Siri and just make her make stupid remarks, not understanding the context. So how is it designing for something that's also sort of a laughing stock?
Well, and it's funny. You showed the clip of the child talking to Alexa. You know, and I was on the team when that clip came out, and we're like, it doesn't play that unless it's in their library. Awkward. But we want to tell ourselves stories about how these things go. But I think it's the laughing stock aspect of it is an important reminder as a designer that your fingers are on the pulse, like you're at the center of the tech universe, and it's a heavy weight. Like people use humor to deal with things that are almost incomprehensible. So it's a sign that you're getting really close to the core of what worries people. You know, that was Her too as well. But it can be tough. We knew that there was a lot of review of the text that we put into the system because we knew that it's so easy for the things that happen with the system to be taken out of context. Context is so important, and like you mentioned, most of these systems are still fairly stupid, for lack of a better word. We project intelligence onto them, but they're not learning or adapting to us terribly much, even still.
I wonder, in a very sort of specific level, do you design for expectations then? I mean, expectation you can't see, but you sort of have to. With Siri, you have to understand if you ask for somebody's age, you can ask for your wife's age because she's in your phone book, but you can't ask for anybody else's age, for example. And I kind of learned that over time when Siri keeps telling me that, well, that person isn't in your contact book. But how do you design for people's expectations?
Well, I guess the first thing is to be familiar with their expectations in the moment, one at a time. I think it's really complex. I heard Cheryl talk at a different conference, actually, and she spoke about the scripts that you have to write in order to deal with the conversations, right? You have to be explicit. The computer does only and knows what to say, only what you teach it how to say, in a way. And so I don't know. I think Cheryl might have more insight on that.
I think the only way to cope with it is to obviously there's perfect design process where you have infinite time and infinite resources and you test everything beforehand, but that's not the reality of like designing for Alexa when you're putting in prompts that respond to current events, for example. So you just need to be really connected to your customers and humble enough to understand that you have the power of accidentally insulting or making someone happy, like understanding that it's not just feedback anymore from this isn't functional, it's this caused a negative emotional response, and you have to be able to respond very quickly to that. So systems that allow you to like push corrections if you find out that something was written a little bit poorly. But context is important.
How does AI play into this?
I think over time, as we get a better understanding of a customer or a person in general, you can start to understand, I loved the demo with the motion capture system and the discussion of emotion. There's no emotional awareness yet in these systems, but it's so powerful. If we can understand that you're stressed, then maybe we shouldn't interrupt you, or maybe we should be briefer with our responses because we just need to get out of your way. And there's so many cues we could pull out. Eye contact, physicalization if there's a camera involved, but tone of voice, the words you choose. But it goes back to like brute force. We haven't learned yet what is the language of emotion. But if we learn that, then I think we can genuinely start to design preemptively to prevent hurting people accidentally. Whereas right now it's mostly we do our best and we listen.
Siri doesn't work in a crowd, so there's one technique that still works, which is this. If you have anything to add, there's one there in the back. Oh.
Well, hello. Now we just talked about like ethics and AR and how conversational UI can like help us interact with our phones without us actually looking at them. But this also presents like an omnipresent UI. So how do you think that like ethically could it like invade our privacy and also like interfere in our like regular everyday conversations?
Yeah, I mean, from our side, I think this is probably something that no matter what will happen, and like something that we have to really think about as designers or developers or companies from the beginning, because we have, for example, talked a lot about it when we talk with IKEA. It's like if you suddenly start to be present, not just with a visual interface, but with conversation, how do you act as a brand and how do you respect the user? Like, do you just keep on prompting spam when you walk down the street because we think it's relevant? Or how do we protect the people's knowledge or data so it doesn't become creepy? Is it one person? Is it multiple? And all those questions suddenly is one thing now, but if they will start to be all around us while walking, besides just being in our pocket, it becomes a different scenario. And I think, we'll probably quite soon be just used to it like we are today, where people, they bring up their phone, I think it's like 100 times a day, use it in average 4 hours a day in Denmark.
So you're on the Mark Zuckerberg team, privacy is dead, but you all remember that
photo? Yeah, but I would say that we should still fight it.
But you do remember that photo that made the rounds about a year ago with Zuckerberg with blocking his camera and his and the microphone on his computer. You touched upon it yesterday as well, because the camera is in the bedroom, this whole sort of invasive thing. You'd like to comment?
Sure. Yesterday I talked about the importance of understanding the customer problem you're trying to solve, and I think we were just remarking about the AR clip that you guys showed and how frightening it is. But I think one of the things that stands out to me about that clip, where there's just ads everywhere, is it's not solving the customer's problem in that moment. The customer's navigating the street and they're being bombarded. And so it's tough because we have to trust all the brands we interact with to have our best interests at heart. And I hope that customers will vote with their wallets if a company is not making a choice in my own best interest. When we worked on Alexa notifications, we knew we did not want to interrupt the sanctity of the home. It was a very fraught area. But one thing we kept coming back to was, is the information we're providing a customer actionable in the moment? Like saying my Uber is outside my door is actionable and it's time sensitive, and so maybe that warrants an interruption, but a package is coming sometime later today. There's nothing I can do about that, really. So that's probably not the right time for interruption. We had this problem in the car too, where we tried to tell people when we were testing when notifications were appropriate, and if we tried to tell people their tire pressure was low while driving, it caused extra stress, because now they're worried about the state of the car and there's nothing they can do about it while they're in motion. So they're like, should I pull over? And we didn't intend for them to want to pull over. We just wanted to be helpful. So we learned, for things that they couldn't act on in the moment, wait.
But the only thing, just to jump in, is if everybody thinks that, like, at some point, like, it's kind of also what happened when the internet, like, everybody at the end has good intentions, but together, if there's not some sort of control,
yes,
it ends up being, apeshit crazy with ads all over. And I think, at the end, this is down to, like, the business model. Like, if advertising will still be the fuel for all these digital experiences, I don't think we can escape all these annoying ads, or at least in my view, annoying ads. I just yesterday saw Showtime. They're now using the user CPUs to actually mine bitcoins or a cryptocurrency in order to earn money while people are streaming, instead of showing banner ads, and even made a survey where people said, yeah, actually I would rather have you to do that. So it's also about how can we remove that.
Cool. I'm not a designer, but I might suggest an on-off button for the camera. The old, old-fashioned.
Oh, it has one, trust me. It's pretty much the first thing we designed.
There's a question down here. Did that go away again? Do you have a mic?
Yeah, hello. Do you think there are any specific kinds of experiences or interactions that really lend themselves to conversational UIs?
What?
So to restate the question, are there any types of interactions that lend themselves well to conversational UIs? That's a really interesting question, and I think it's also culturally dependent. Christina, I'm blanking on her last name, but she spoke at Interaction 17, and she made the point that in China, folks gravitated more towards trusting a more verbose, conversational UI for transactional things like making a purchase, whereas like folks in the United States kind of prefer to not feel like there's someone in the way. And so some of it's really contextually, or culturally specific. And I don't know if I would be qualified to answer the question. Like, it's an interesting question back to folks who live in Europe. Like, what is your cultural identity, and where do you think conversation is important? Because it doesn't have to be the same answer for everybody.
I think especially when people are on the move, I see like when you're driving a car, or if you're biking, if you're running, if you are at your home cooking, those elements where like it's just more natural to speak is one of the best use cases I see at the moment, at least.
Yeah, I would reflect back also on just everyday life. When do we have a tendency to use buttons as opposed to saying something or doing like telling a voice UI, rewind that to this minute is probably more labor intensive than just moving the little, if you're watching a video, moving the little toggle to that point in the video. So it's really relevant to real life. It's easier. What takes less cognitive load?
It kind of brings us back to discussion we had at Design Matters last year, where it was about designing for fun and casual, sort of a more less stiff brands. And MailChimp, of course, was a great example of that, of a brand that has sort of a very chatty feel. They're warm and you can talk to them. And this brings us back to this whole thing of designing personality. You talked about the emotions before. So why would I but that's with Typeform, why would I rather give my data to, what kind of personality would I like to give my data to?
Yeah, that depends on who's doing the form, right?
Exactly.
So the audience that the customer has at the end of the day, they know their audience hopefully better than we do. What we strive to do is give them more choice.
Yeah.
We give them as much choice as we can, and that's the direction that we're growing in, so that essentially the customer can customize the UI in their own direction so that it speaks better and that has the personality they do know will resonate. We get a lot of requests for wanting to infuse their own kind of a whitewash, right? The big brands especially, they want to be able to communicate with their own UI and have the brand come through that. So.
Yeah, but it's interesting, I guess. If you're a smaller brand with a very sort of narrow target group, I totally see personality. You like the Quartz newsletter, which is just written to you, and you're just sort of a core subscriber to that. So it totally makes sense that they can hit a personality that you would like. But I don't want a strong connection to Walmart. I mean, and I don't know what kind of personality IKEA would have. Anna is a good name, of course, but what kind of personality? How would you design a personality for IKEA?
That's a really good question. If you have answers, let us know. But for now, at least, we have discussed a lot this whole gentrification of the assistant, which I think totally makes sense if you're a big brand who's actually moving the technology like you guys are. But as a brand, we are not really having any control of it. So what we had talked about is like IKEA is very like a democratic Swedish company. They are always very much about the co-workers. So in for example, Place, where there's a few early elements of conversations, we talk about we can help you with something instead of I can help you. And it doesn't have a name, it's just IKEA talking to you. And instead of having it basically be like this new assistant that we will also launch, we kind of believe that that will be won by the big technology companies. And we should more find ways to interact with those instead.
It's interesting the mention of like pronouns like we and things like that, because they also get tied up in gendered in some cultures too. And I know that's a hot topic. Is a lot of the assistants are female right now? Is that appropriate? Why is it there? There's some really great research by Clifford Nass about like perception and gender. Although again, I think it's kind of very culturally based. But that's one question you kind of have to ask your customers. Like, there was a mention of principles-based design, and for Cortana, and I know Alexa also, they start with like a list of 5 descriptors that they want that personality to evoke. And then you can sort of evaluate any individual prompt by those few principles you chose for the assistants. That's a good place to start as a group.
I think we have a question.
Hi, I was just going to ask, I feel like a lot of these kind of personal assistant services and AR is a lot about facilitating existing tasks and just a lot about convenience. And I'm wondering when and I guess what kind of future we can envision where they would actually be improving quality of life in a different way, or enabling tasks that we can't even fathom or we don't do currently.
So when will they address not just better what we do today, but new tasks?
When, but I'm also curious about like the possibilities, I guess.
I mean, I think healthcare is going to be a huge area.
Healthcare?
There's a lot of rumors that both Amazon and Apple and all those are moving into that field. I know Apple just recently made a project with Stanford to understand how Siri can act more responsible when people are asking questions they would normally ask a shrink, because that they see in their data, and how to then accommodate that best. I definitely think that the conversation, whether that's text or voice, will be a huge thing within healthcare. And then how that's going to act or who's going to be the players is still to be seen, but for sure a huge industry that haven't been really disrupted. And if you look in the States right now, where a lot is being driven, there's a huge need to fix it. So I wouldn't be surprised that could be a new one. I also think, just quick, and the reason why we had augmented reality in, which is not really conversational, is that suddenly there will be way more experiences where you could have a conversation, you could imagine movies that are more multi-interaction instead of a linear story, etc., etc.
So just to understand what you're saying more specifically, I don't have to be the stupid here. Of course, we have Siri to be the stupid in this conversation, but what do you mean by healthcare besides it hasn't been disrupted? What do you mean more specifically?
I mean, for example, simple things is that you still need to go to a doctor. A lot of times, that could be something that you could have over a phone call, but people maybe don't feel comfort, or maybe the doctors are too fragmented and don't have the money to actually launch a big digital service like we have seen in the cab industry where Uber came. I definitely see that in that area now with conversational and also machine learning, we will be able to detect things that could be fixed earlier. So it will be more predictive and more conversational than what we have now. Whether that's like, hey, I have noticed that you've been stressed for a little while now, or your blood pressure is not looking that good, remember to check up.
I think that Apple recently put out a post for looking for psychologists to help with Siri's conversational cues in situations where it looks like a human may be in distress, or and I think it's interesting because there's healthcare and then there's all kinds of regulation, and I think that's a really great startup market. And then there's this gray area where we need a connection with another human, and maybe I live alone, or maybe it's just a really tough time. There is potential there if companies are willing to take on the risk. Legal departments do not like that risk, but offering the suicide prevention number when we detect, maybe not just saying I'm literally thinking about suicide, but I show signs, maybe I'm not interacting as much with it, or maybe biosigns are down if we've got other signals. That's one example of how we could kind of ride the gray area to improve lives.
So just as a side comment, I guess, is that when I think about things like this, healthcare and having a psychologist, and Apple is a big company, right? And this word disrupt, in this industry, in healthcare, people's lives are at stake. Mm-hmm. And so it's a different type of disruption. Disruption is messy, and often there's unintended consequences. But when the stakes are so high, I think that we should be thinking about it differently and coming from a different angle. The whole, fail fast is great when it's not somebody's life on the line. But if you design the UI of some really dangerous machine incorrectly, somebody can die. And I don't think we talk about it enough as a design community, as an industry. These are really serious things. Medicine has the Hippocratic Oath, right? The do no harm. Should we be having conversations about having an oath like that? I think we should.
Oh, right there.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question is, systems or software design today tends to be like pretty specialized. So for example, like OpenTable might be really good for booking reservations, but really bad for calling a car. And one of the really great strengths of visual interfaces is that they're great at sort of setting expectations and leading people down the right path so that they can arrive at good outcomes. How do you think that's like sort of similar patterns or norms for setting expectations could be incorporated into voice UI? Do you think that voice UI actually has the potential, voice or conversational UI has the potential to live up to visual UI in terms of leading people down the right paths? And how do you think about like conversational UI for like input versus output?
Well, I think that broadly, information architecture kind of differs when you're working on a voice interface as opposed to a visual interface. Visual interfaces are really good at that deep engagement, walking you through several steps. Voice is helpful when you have an infinite number of tasks you can start with all at once. And one thing I try to counsel new voice designers on is don't try to replace visual interfaces. Because if you talk about the long-term future, your point with the augmented reality is that these things won't always exist in isolation. There are going to be some things that voice is best for and some things that visuals are best for. And in some cases where you can't get visuals, voice will help you get some of the way away. But I mentioned yesterday the importance of reincorporation, and that's basically the key design pattern we have to guide folks, but it's very limited. Our auditory memory is very different than our visual memory. We can process less, and so you have to chunk your tasks much differently. It's much harder to do a bunch at once, so it takes a lot more structure. You can replicate some complicated things from visual UI and voice, but it's not always better.
So do we overfocus in a way in these years? Because it's just the new thing. I mean, you touched upon that yesterday as well. You have like different interactions that is sort of in play at the same time. And we focus very much on this thing because it's the new thing. So it works better in
certain circumstances, yeah. Like the early Xbox Connect had this see it, say it approach where it had like next and previous, and you could move back and forth through the interface. And customers didn't really respond to that because they had a controller in arm's reach. It just wasn't improving on things. But what was really engaging was when they enabled search, and you could say which service is Back to the Future streaming on, and get an answer to that. It was needle in a haystack problems are really great for voice. So that's one example of a situation where you might want to go. But navigation, visual UI and physical UI tend to be better at that. And there's other things about that too, like the words we've chosen for next and previous are so short that there's a high rate of failure.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that's important is just to remember that like until now, technology has been very linear in the way that we had very few devices, and now we're seeing a completely different landscape, where like we have multiple devices, multiple ways of interacting, so there will probably never come just one thing that takes over the other thing anymore. It would probably be a lot more like complementary technologies that you need to choose as a designer or as a company, like which one is best for which scenario, and maybe even have multiple options going forward depending on the context, which is really, really difficult suddenly to manage, but it's probably what people will expect.
Yeah.
Hey, so there are a lot of technological improvements in hardware, like voice-enabled systems, but the smartphone is something that's pretty ubiquitous, and it's gaining a lot of penetration in developing markets, and so I foresee that it'll be really big for a while to come. How does conversational UI, whether it's voice-enabled or not, factor in this long in-between with smartphones, and how would you recommend trust being garnered when things are going to get a lot more personal, such as dealing with banking or loans or health or just more personal information?
One thing that a pattern I've seen come through is the need for transparency to build trust. I had a student in one of my classes describe asking for a 3-minute timer on Siri, and Siri responding, "Okay, I set your timer. Don't burn the eggs." And she had this out of body moment because she never told Siri she was in the kitchen making eggs. It just jumped to this conclusion, but didn't share how, and it broke a trust covenant in a weird way. And that's a really low stakes example, but that transparency, I think, is very important. If we get to the point where we're making lives better by making proactive suggestions or trying to save time, being clear as to how we came to that decision. The other thing really quick is that responding in kind is really important. It's a very simple principle. Like if someone speaks to you, speak back, but if they start the interaction in text, don't start speaking at them, even if your device is capable of it. Like let your customer tell you how they want to interact in the moment and let them move seamlessly back and forth. If I started in voice with you and then I realized I needed to check my bank balance, don't trap me into voice just because I started that way. Recognize that maybe we've dropped into sensitive territory.
I also think it really depends on the area. Like for example, India and China, big parts of Southeast Asia and Africa, who are the areas where there is the most who will still get online now in a faster pace than we've seen before. A lot of those are not as comfortable of reading and writing as we have been, for example, in Denmark or in Europe, in the States, and where voice or video, I think, will be way beyond what we have seen in the others, not just because it's more progressed now, but also because that people have different needs. If you look in China, there's still a lot of people who still use kind of like this hair-tail kind of way where you speak a little message and send that instead of typing, because their way of typing is just way more complicated than what we have with QWERTY. And that certainly opens up this new world where one thing is what happens in the States and Europe, but I mean the new big interesting area is going to be China, Nigeria, Indonesia, and India, and they have completely different patterns of interacting, which is why, at least from our side, we believe that it will probably go faster than what we expected. When the first smartphone came, a lot of people were like, yeah, but it's going to be feature phones still a lot from these markets. But what we see now is the adoption of smartphones, even in those areas, are way, way beyond what everybody expected.
A short answer to that is don't trust ad-driven tech companies, no matter how well they design it. There's another question there.
Yeah, hi. Right now, a lot of the technology is platform-based, and I know, from the visual interface, we have a lot of different apps that do the same thing, and they have their strengths, right? So you have Google Maps, and you have Apple Maps, and you have, at least in the States, Waze, and you have some other, different developers that have developed different strengths. Is there an appetite for that sort of modularity on voice interfaces where you could patch in some sort of application that would order pizza from the place that you usually order pizza from or something like that?
That's a good question. We're going from a million apps to one because we expect the one app to sort of give us all the answers.
I mean, we have discussed this a lot, also because we are not really in the driving seat, depending on who you follow, whether that's Amazon, Facebook, Apple. They all seem to try to make their own assistant, and I think Google is the only one who haven't given it a name yet. I don't know if it's because they plan to make everybody give it their own name, but what we have discussed is how will that interaction be? Because I mean, I can talk with my mom about everything, but I don't want to talk with my mom about everything. We want to talk to more people. And I still believe that people have a natural lust to talk to more people than just one person all day long. How that will function or whether that will happen, I don't know. I know Google is testing out where you can call in Nike if you have a question. Alexa has the same, where you can call in different skills that you can then have interactions with. So the assistant becomes the facilitator of a conversation beyond.
A really good example of what you're talking about is the recently announced partnership between Alexa and Cortana. because Microsoft is specialized in enterprise and productivity, and Cortana's, we spend a lot of time working on scheduling meetings, trying to find openings in people's calendars, and there's no real benefit to Amazon to try to reinvent the wheel there, and so they've started a collaboration where when you need that kind of information, you can ask Cortana, and if you're talking to Cortana and you need some of the things Alexa's great at, like home automation, you can go there. But I think we're getting to a point where the limiting factor for our UI is we can understand what words you're speaking, but we don't yet have a model of human knowledge that allows us to go from automated speech recognition to understanding that in the context you're speaking about, which is specific to maybe sports, that the things you're talking about relate in this way. So I think we will have to get to a place where somebody develops a specialized set of conversational models for sports, and then all of these systems can take them in. I could talk for hours about that. It's a good question.
But do you think it's going to happen?
I do. Well, I think it has to happen, and I think the other way that that sort of plug-in mentality is really going to save the industry, hopefully, is to help us unravel bias, because the systems that have been engineered today are inherently tuned towards the people who initially did the utterances, which, and let's be frank, still, it's at best 25% female, and a lot of times it's mostly Americans, and you know how hard it is to unlearn a bad habit. We basically have voice systems that have learned one very specific way of processing. But if we had a model that you could plug in that understands specifically Danish, and you can plug in Danish grammar and Danish concepts into an existing system that's good at other things, that would be huge. But it's such a brute force problem that it's going to take forever if one company is doing it sequentially.
Just got to take one last question.
Hey, y'all. So our main mode of communication went from voice to messaging. So now that now the voice UI is becoming more prominent, do you think there's going to be a change in the industry? Like, will messaging be as big, and will we change our main mode of communication?
What do you think?
So I mean, messaging has kind of become second nature. I don't think it's going to go away. I think we've had the microphone and recording enabled, chat UI on Siri forever, and I don't know how much it's used, So I think it's just a question of what's more appropriate at the time, what's more comfortable for the person. And it seems like chat is quite comfortable even for younger generations that seem to prefer it more.
Super brief comments from the two of you.
I think that one thing that's interesting about conversational UIs, text-based messaging, is it's not just text. Like, there's so much multimedia and imagery and emoji usage. And I don't think conversational UI, like the other side, the computer side, understands that yet. So I think I don't think humans will change. I think we'll have to adapt our text-based interfaces to start to understand those signals.
Yeah, and I definitely think voice is going to be big, but I also think that very soon we're going to see that the intelligence will take over and limit a lot of the interactions we used to have. Like, if you look at how many interactions that has been limited now, from logging in, shutting down your computer, all the pop-ups, now it's just acting in background. Like, instead of saying, turn on the lights, maybe we'll just turn on the lights, and there's a lot of these predictive interactions that are more like interactions based on intuition almost, rather than you prompting, being the operating system all the time yourself.
So, yet another panel discussion ended with the fact that you will mean less and technology more. We are out of time for questions, I'm sorry. Please give a hand to the panel.